Channel 9, I said, there's been no moral compass in the guidance of its news management ever. Foot in the door journalism, checkbook journalism, you name it, they've been in it. You know, it's a tabloid outfit from go to woe. You know, I mean, 30 years ago we introduced this legislation, and what Australians have had for 30 years is no more great agglomerations as we used to have. We had a separate set of newspaper owners in television. In 7, Kerry Stokes. In 9, formerly the Packers, now publicly owned, and of course in 10, right? In print, we had the Fairfax group of newspapers and mastheads, the Age, the Sydney Morning Herald, the AFR, etc. We had the News Limited clutch of papers, and then we had a completely independent group of radio stations. Right. What this does is jam half of that into one company. It goes back to the old. This is a disgraceful piece of legislation to needlessly remove this instrument of diversity, which has guaranteed the Australian polity 3 decades. I mean, has anyone ever heard say, "Oh, we're not getting enough news," or "We don't get a diversity of news"? Of course, that didn't happen by accident. This is all Turnbull. This is Turnbull and the Liberal Party going back to monopolies. They believe in monopolies at best and duopolies at worst.
Well, let me take you through this. I mean, the Prime Minister has welcomed the merger today.
Well, he's the author of the damn thing.
But he says it makes both companies stronger in a competitive market. Essentially, they need to scale up. They need to scale up
it's all wrong.
Because they've got these global digital giants to compete with.
Let me do it. There's 2 issues here. The big truth is that Facebook and Google have cut a massive swath out of the revenues, the advertising of traditional media companies, including television and radio and print businesses. That is true. What is not true, and what is definitely not true, is that the news we have locally about our electricity prices, our education, our schools, the state of the parties, the personalities of the political leaders, all these issues are never going to come via scatty websites on the internet. They're not going to come from Google. You know, yes, you can clock into the New York Times, you can get on to Bloomberg, but that's not going to tell you about the railway to Bankstown or what's happening in the suburbs of Melbourne. In other words, the argument that the advent of the internet means that people are getting their news, their important major news, local news, via the net and not by the major wholesaling organisations in print and television is a complete furphy.
But you see, the board of Nine, chaired by another former treasurer, Peter Costello, says, look, this merger doesn't matter. They have given an assurance that the Fairfax editorial charter of independence will be honoured.
The Fairfax Board of Management sold out. That's what's happened here. They sold out. They sold out the culture, they sold out the polity, they sold out their opportunity. All they had to do was find, I mean, they've managed a most difficult period. I give them that.
But they say they've got a deal. They've got a deal with the Nine board, a gentleman's agreement, if you will, to say...
I mean, if you believe in that, you shouldn't be in journalism, Ellen. You should give the game up, you know. I mean, it's hopeless. I mean, look, they'll have the Nine network, the whole Nine network across the country. They'll have the Sydney Morning Herald, the Age, the Financial Review. They'll have the big radio stations, you know, like 2GB in Sydney with Alan Jones and Neil Mitchell in Melbourne with 3AW, etc. I'm not saying these particular commentators or journalists are going to be run by the Channel 9 board, but the agglomeration of the power, if you look at the political power, which has been wrapped up, and why, but for what reason?
But so what do you feel in terms of editorial interference? Are you talking about a tabloid influence, a political influence?
Look, just make this point. Whenever you have diverse groups in print, radio and television, you have safety. You have a smorgasbord of views and outlets.
But
Once you shove that into half of this into one company, you know, and of course, you know, the Libs have always moved towards single big companies because they think the big companies see their way of the world. And this was true of the Herald and Weekly Times, and it was true of the old Fairfax.
So do you fear political interference in this deal, and where would you see it coming from?
Well, what I see is it's like a sort of media organisations set a kind of let's call it a kind of a tune and a bias that you don't have to tell journalists what to write; they just write it anyway.
And what would the tune? What would the tune be?
I'm just saying. Well, the thing is that this need not have happened. You see, what is disgraceful in all this is the turnover of the cross-media rules. I mean, why would you let a television station own the principal newspaper masthead? Why would you? You know, I mean, does anyone think that on Bloomberg, out of the New York Times, out of the BBC, out of specialised websites, they're going to find out about planning issues in Sydney or planning issues in Melbourne, you know, or electricity issues or health issues?
Well, the ACCC
of course they're not.
The ACCC, the competition watchdog, has to have a look at it. What role should they play in all of this?
Well, it depends on what powers they have under the Act, but they should strike this thing down. In my opinion, they should strike it down. I mean, you know, if the Fairfax Management and Board really cared about the culture of Fairfax, about its 140-year-old history, notwithstanding the fact that it is true that Google and Facebook have cut the guts right out of their revenues, that the alternative revenues, the domains of this world, which are a cause of strong revenue growth within the Fairfax Group and other, can cross-subsidise the newspapers. But what's going on here is they're saying, oh no, it's not legitimate to cross-subsidise the newspapers.
You put out a 2.5-page statement today. You said, for over half a century, Nine has displayed the ethics of an alley cat.
Yeah.
The pus from the Nine carbuncle will inevitably leak into Fairfax.
Of course it will.
Why do you have such a dim view of Nine? Because
it's such a lowbrow outfit. You know, I just said it. You know, checkbook journalism, foot in the door journalism. I mean, it's a lowbrow show, and it always has been. And people who've worked there have been happy to take the money working for a lowbrow outfit.
And I mean, I have to ask, is this in any sense, this dim view that you have of Nine, driven by the sort of journalism they did, the 60-minute story way back in the day on the piggery?
Look, I've fought more television and radio companies than anyone in the business, and my fight in a series of issues I've had with Nine were all about one thing and one thing only: Kerry Packer trying to get hold of control of John Fairfax and Sons. And because as Prime Minister I prevented Kerry Packer lifting his share of John Fairfax from 14.9% to control, you know, Kerry Packer had the Nine network chase me in private life. You know, but I'm a big boy. I know how to punch. People said to me after a whole series of things on 60 Minutes, it turns out, they said, Mr Keating, are you going to take Mr Packer to court for defamation? I said, no, I have more expensive remedies in mind for Mr Packer. And the expensive remedy was taking Fairfax from him, which I had Brian Harradine do in 97 or 98.
When Brian Harradine was in the Senate.
Yeah, in other words, I made sure that he didn't allow Howard to get a majority to do then what Turnbull's doing today.
How did you get Brian Harradine to vote those changes down to the media ownership laws?
Well, he was an intelligent guy. He understood the stuff, and he had a good social heart.
Mr Keating, we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, Ellen. Thanks.